Hey guys, it's Vicky, and today I'm here to do a special sort of video, and it's one that I have seen a few booktubers do. I wasn't going to do this video initially, but after seeing a few booktubers do it, notably Bobby at Bobby Reads Too Much and Katie over at Life Between Words, I decided I want to talk about my favorite books of the decade. I really thought that this was going to be kind of a hard list to compile, but it was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be, mainly because I just looked back at the books that I've read over the past 10 years, and the ones that were really impactful, the ones that I still think about, jumped out at me, and I'm like, those are the ones. Those are the favorites. So I should note, most of these books, maybe not most of them, but quite a few weren't even published in the past 10 years, so this is not that sort of decade list. These are books that came into my life in the past decade and that have become favorites that I will probably reread over and over again in my life, ones that I love very much, and I want to share them with you. Alright, so no particular order here. I'm just gonna go from the top of the stack to the bottom of the stack. In this first one, I want to look and see, when did I first read this? I first read this book in 2011, and then I reread it in 2015. So if that doesn't tell me that it's a favorite, I don't know what does, that I've read it twice in the past 10 years. And that book is The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. This book, originally, I think I picked it up because I was like, oh, I've heard of that, and I'm like, oh, it'll be a quick read. I checked it out from the library, and I absolutely loved this book. It's about a teenager named Charlie who is entering high school, and he's very shy and reserved, and it's about him making friends and about kind of the first of his high school years. And yeah, this book just, I don't know if it was the formatting, because it's told through letters that he's writing to somebody that you don't know who that person is, but I don't know if that was if the formatting was what did it or whatever, but I just loved this book. And funny enough, I looked on Goodreads and I still have only given this a 4-star rating. I need to up it to a 5 because this is definitely a favorite, and it's funny because now that I'm looking at it, I want to read it again. All right, my next favorite read is one that I read in 2017. It's one of, I think, 2 nonfiction books that I have on this list, and that book is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. This book was just so amazingly written. For being a nonfiction book, it doesn't read that way. It tells the story about this family that was murdered in Kansas in the 1950s, in 1959 to be exact. And Truman Capote decided he wanted to go and cover the event and write a book about it. And it's about that experience. And the way he writes it is just, it's very much a like narrative nonfiction. It draws you in. The story is really sad, but I felt like he wrote it so well. I did not think I was going to love this book as much as I did, to be honest, but I really did, and it's one I will definitely revisit in the future. And I think it's safe to say, this next book, a lot of people are going to have this author's book, one of her books or all of her books, on a favorites list for the decade, because she was one of the, I feel, dominating female writers of the decade. That author is Gillian Flynn, and I'm putting Dark Places on my list. I have read all of her books, and this one is my favorite. There's just something about this story that is just so dark, and the mystery element is so interesting. It's about a girl named Libby. Yes, Libby, who, as a child, her family was killed, and her brother was convicted of killing them all. And as an adult, though, she starts to question whether he actually did it and starts to look into it more. And it's just a really good story. It took turns I didn't think it was gonna take. The ending was shocking. I loved it. I loved it. All of her books are fantastic. This one is just my favorite. Oh, and I first read Dark Places in 2015. Next up is another nonfiction read that I first read in 2018, and that was Educated by Tara Westover. This is a very popular memoir that came out, and yeah, it was one of those books, again, that the story was just so crazy that, again, I still think about it. I still think about some of the stuff that she went through, some of the stuff that her family just did and believed in, because she grew up with parents that did not believe in modern medicine, like going to the hospital if they were sick. They didn't believe in the school system, so none of them went to school. And it's just about her kind of overcoming that and rising above that. And so her story is crazy, at times very heartbreaking, because she also suffered physical and mental abuse by one of her older brothers. So it is heartbreaking, it is crazy, but it's also uplifting and inspiring because she found a way to overcome a lot of those obstacles. And yeah, fantastic. I don't have a copy of this book. I listened to it on audio, and I need to get a copy though because I want it on my shelves because it's one that I will definitely revisit. Next up is a book I first read in 2011, and the reason it made this list is because I still think about it. And it was one of those books, I think, I have never had such a physical reaction to a book, I don't think, as I did reading this book. And that book is Room by Emma Donoghue. I read it on my Kindle, so I don't have a physical copy. But I remember there's a scene in this book, and I won't say what it is, but that my heart was racing, and I was almost shaking. And when the scene ended, I started bawling, which doesn't happen very often, but it was so intense and so powerful that I will never forget it. Room is a story about a young boy, and it's told through his eyes, that he is living in this room, and it's all he's ever known, he and his mother. And you find out that it's because his mother had been abducted, and that he was a product of that abduction, and they're basically held captive, except for him, that's his normal life. He doesn't know any differently, and it's about their experience in Room. And yeah, such a powerful book, such a powerful book, so many emotions. I loved it. Next up is a book I have talked about quite a bit on this channel in the past year because I read it this year in 2019. Well, I read it last year in 2019, and it was one of my favorite books, but it's definitely one of my favorites of the decade. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this because, like I said, I've talked about it a lot this year, but that book is The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. It tells the story of a guy named Cyril who is growing up in Ireland, and it spans his lifetime. It starts from before he is born until he is 70. And every chapter, I believe it skips every 7 years. So you see glimpses of his childhood, his teenage years, and all of that. And it's just about him growing up in Ireland and realizing that he is gay and basically dealing with that because it's something he really struggles with. And it's a beautiful story. Cyril is one of those characters I will never forget, and I can't wait to reread this someday. Next up is probably one of the most surprising books on this list because I don't tend to like sci-fi type books. I read this book in 2016 and it was amazing, and that book is The Martian by Andy Weir. Like I said, I do not read a lot of sci-fi. It tends to bore me, it tends to intimidate me, but this book was so interesting. It's about a guy named Mark. Is it Mark? Yes. Who is an astronaut, and he basically gets stuck on Mars, and he has to figure out a way to survive until his crew can come back to get him. And so it's very much a survival story. Mark is one of those characters that is so funny, and he has so much ingenuity and so much like hope. It was just such an inspiring read, and I got so much out of this that I wasn't expecting to get. It was so entertaining, it was so intense. It was fantastic, and yeah, I loved it. This next book shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. It's definitely one of my favorite horror novels now of all time, but I first read it in 2015, and yeah, I just love this story so much. It's Nosferatu by Joe Hill. Again, I went into this book not having very high expectations, but the story blew me away. It is a vampire story in a sense that our villain, Charlie Manx, is a vampire of sorts, but it's not blood that he seeks. I won't say what it is that he does seek, but he's a different sort of vampire-like bad guy. This book deals with childhood and growing up, and how you could be one way as a child and you change into adulthood, and kind of dealing with that. And it also deals a lot with kind of like imagination and just the way the mind works. And there's just so many things. This book is one of the most original, unique stories I've ever read. I just absolutely loved this book. There were parts that terrified me. There were parts that made me cry and tugged on my heartstrings. I just love this book, and I can't wait to reread it someday. I know I'm going to say that with a lot of these books, but this book was awesome, and I can't recommend it enough. This next one is another horror novel, again, that is probably not going to be a surprise to anybody. I read this book in 2018, and I loved it so much. Summer of Night by Dan Simmons. This book has one of my favorite tropes in it, which is a group of friends fighting evil. It's so nostalgic. It makes you so nostalgic for childhood, but it is also downright creepy. There were some scenes in this book that I was just like, wow, that just made my skin crawl. And then there's a huge twist in about the halfway point that I did not see coming, that I couldn't believe happened. It was so shocking. I loved this so much, so much. And I hadn't even heard of this book up until, I think it was 2018. I happened to pick it up because I heard somebody else talking about it. And I'm like, how have I missed this book for such a huge chunk of my life? Because it is amazing. It is amazing. This next book I read in 2016, and I will always remember it because I was in my first trimester of pregnancy with my son. So I wasn't feeling 100%, and I had jury duty. So I sat in a courthouse for like 7 hours. Never got called to the courtroom, but I had to sit there for quite a while. And this book was the perfect book to just sit there and just gobble up because I couldn't put it down. And that book is Big Little Lies by Leanne Moriarty. Yeah, this is about a group of moms and I believe they're kindergarten aged children. And it's just kind of like the drama that they deal with within their little community. And then there's also like a murder mystery. So it's just so unputdownable. I loved this book. Really, really enjoyed it. And I, again, didn't think it would be something I would like as much as I did, but it really surprised me. Next up, we have a classic that I cannot believe I didn't read until 2017. What was I doing? What was I doing with my life? This classic was so enjoyable, and I was surprised by that because, you know, sometimes classics are tough to get through. This one was not. That book is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I loved this story. It's so gothic. It had a kind of a mystery, almost like not a thriller, but like there definitely is like a mystery going on that I wasn't expecting. It's a coming of age book. Jane is such an interesting character. I just loved her and identified with her on many levels. There's a romance. I mean, it kind of has everything, but mostly it's the gothic nature of the book that really draws you in, and keeps you there. And yeah, I loved this, and I still can't believe that I didn't read this until 2017, but I will definitely be reading it again. Next up is another horror novel that I read in 2017. Let me look. 2017. 2017 was a good year for favorites for me. This book, again, it was like I picked it up, thought I'd give it a try, and it blew me away. And now I want to read everything this man has ever written, and that is The Elementals by Michael McDowell. This book is so atmospheric. If you want some Southern Gothic stories, you gotta read Michael McDowell. This book, the elements just work so well, and he has a way of making things that normally are not creepy. He makes them creepy. It's about two families, I believe, that come together every summer, and they each own a house on the beach. And then there's this house in the middle that is, nobody lives there. And it's filling with sand, and some creepy crap happens. And I loved this so much. Like I said, it was so atmospheric. He just has a way of writing settings, and even the characters in here were super interesting. There's a father-daughter relationship in here that I liked that was very kind of unconventional, but it just worked for me. Yeah, I loved this book. Loved this book. Okay, another classic, more of a modern classic, that I read in 2018 that I also was so pleasantly surprised by. Yeah, this was a good one, guys. Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. I know this book has its issues, okay? It's racist, okay? We know that. But that aside, there's so much in this book to think about, because in the end, it's about gumption. It's about what would you do if you were put through a very difficult hardship? What would you do to preserve yourself and to preserve the people that you really loved? The thing about this book that I still am amazed by is how much I hated the main character. Scarlett O'Hara is the worst. Cannot stand her. Even Rhett Butler, not the greatest person, but at least he knew he wasn't a great person. Scarlett is just so awful, but I couldn't stop reading her story. I was totally captivated by this book. It went by a lot quicker than I thought it was going to. I mean, I paced myself when I read this. I only read like 20 pages a day, but I was never bored. This book, the story just jumps off the page and you're just so into it. So like I said, racism aside, this book is really, really good. And I would love to reread it someday, but it's a chunky one, so we'll see. But yeah, I love this so much. The next book is a nonfiction that I read in 2016 that still just sits with me, because it was such a heartbreaking story. It was just one of those books that just will stick with you when you read it. And that book is A Mother's Reckoning, Living in the Aftermath of Tragedy by Sue Klebold. This is a memoir that Sue Klebold wrote about her son Dylan, who was one of the shooters at the Columbine school shootings. And it's just her experience, what it was like to be the mother of someone like that. Very, very heartbreaking. You can't help but feel for her. And yeah, it's one of those things that you hear a lot about the victims and their families, as you should, obviously. But a lot of times in this situation, I feel like she was a victim too. She lost her son. She was going about her daily life as if she knew him, and it turns out maybe she didn't. And there were a lot of things about him that she didn't know. And this book is eye-opening in the sense that it can happen to anybody, you know? And yeah, I still think about this book. I don't know if I could ever read it again, only because it just sat so heavy on my heart. But it was powerful, and I appreciate her bravery in writing this. because I'm sure it wasn't easy. And last but not least is a graphic novel series that I read in 2014 and 2015. And it's one of the first graphic novel series I think I ever read, and I just loved it. And I want to reread it because Netflix is doing a series about it, or based off of it. And it's the Lock and Key series by Joe Hill and Gabriel Rodriguez. There are 6 volumes in this series, but I'm only holding up one of them. And this story is so cool. It's just so cool. It's about this family that moves to this house where it's called Key House, where there are these magical keys, and each key does something different, and there are like supernatural forces at play. There's real life dangers at play. It's a really cool story. And actually, like I said, I really want to reread it because of the Netflix series. So this might be, I might be reading this again very soon because I really want to revisit it. It was such a ride. But yeah, it was really cool. Dark, twisted, but also kind of fun. And yeah, I love this. All right, guys, so those are my 15 favorite books of the decade. I tried to narrow it down to 10 and I just couldn't do it. So please let me know down below what your favorite books of the decade were, because I would love to know. And if you also loved these books that I talked about here, please let me know so we can gush about them together. Yeah, that's all I have for today, guys. I hope that you're having a wonderful week, and I'll chat with you very soon. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.